Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Gabriela, for the invitation to the American Society, to Columbia University. Greetings to those watching from Caracas at the Universidad Metropolitana. Weaving the space in between. As if to counteract the turbulent effect of the 1970 chorros and related reticular experiments, Gego initiated in 1974 a series of works entitled troncos, trunks in English, followed in 1976 by another grouping of works known as spheres. The troncos, also called columns in Gego's notebook recording her work from 1971 to 1984, are vertical pieces whose structural soundness, arguably analogous to the supporting role of columns in architecture, are a far cry from the dissipation of the reticularia and the subsequent chorros. Grounded and upheld from the ceiling, or simply resting on the floor, they seem to grow steadily and systematically upward. There exists a variety of these works, some of which are thin and tall, while others are chunky and short. Their virtual core is delineated by stacked rings made of a reticular mesh of intricate connectivity that obeys a system of construction that allows little error, but also varies from one tronco to another. In some instances, the tissue that constitutes the structure is open, airy, transparent, while in other cases is neatly and tightly woven, depending on the polygonal matrix, i.e. pentagonal or hexagonal, that generates the total structure. At times, a line of bronze tubes spirals around the body of the tronco to provide stability and support. One might say that these are the most constructivist of Gego's post-reticularia works. Defined, self-sufficient, structurally sound, systematically constructed, physically, but also, at least in principle, mentally transparent, since as viewers we can identify and penetrate the structure of the work, its configuration, and the logic of its connectivity. It was precisely in 1976 that Gego published with her students from the Institute of Design, Fundación Neumann, Space, Volume, and Organization, a pamphlet that details the increasing complexity of volumes according to their organization in space. The systematic study of classical geometry related to her pedagogical activities at the Institute were evidently the source for this embrace of a self-sufficient organic model where the relationships of parts to a whole defines the operative structure. Moreover, due to her training as an architect, geometry was Gego's lingua franca, or architecture's ideal model or language of communication. Under the aegis of these published studies, directly linked to her seminar of spatial relations developed between 1971 and 1976 at the Institute, Gego returned then to a more systematic use of geometry. During this period, Ruth Auerbach explains, Gego is, quote, dazzled by geometry, end quote. And in words that succinctly define the morphological paradox of the 70s, quote, her interest in geometry grows in proportion to her creative impulse to liberate her discovery, end quote. It is at this point that Gego embarks on a systematic study of the referential universe of the reticularia. Quote, this is Ruth Auerbach again. She focuses her attention on mathematics in art, the analysis of reticular structures, tensegrity, the geodesic proposals of Buckminster Fuller, spherical models, and above all, the transformation of polyhedrons, end quote. Many of the spheres produced during this period are literal translations of the geometric models considered in the pedagogical setting of the Institute. Nevertheless, Gego relished in the pronounced gap between the eidetic dimension of the model and the perceptual ambiguity of the object. And she allowed herself to mock the rigor of the geometrical abstraction by surrounding the sphere with extraneous elements, such as a thin chain of metal beads. Indeed, despite a marked obedience to the morphology of the mathematical models, Gego indulged in a sort of geometric subjectivism that was facilitated by the material transparency of her structures. Surely we can traverse these works with our eyes and see through to the space beyond, the surrounding environment that activates and becomes part of the work. But it is precisely because of these elusive transparency produced by the thin metal rods of aluminum delineating the geometric model without an opaque background facilitating legibility that the intelligible structure dissipates. In other words, physical transparency undermines conceptual transparency due to the impossibility of isolating the work. This condition is furthered by the increasing complexity of the model. For example, in the case of 3 icosahedrons from 1977, or by the inclusion of a sphere within a sphere, as in sphere number 3. These doublings suggested protrusions, deformations, and messiness. No wonder the word messy in English recurs in her descriptions of these works from the 70s. To appreciate Gego's reversals vis-a-vis the exact geometries that occupied her and her students at the Institute, allow me to quote architect Greg Lean. Quote, "There is only one sphere for all cultures for all times. Ideal forms such as these must be reducible to eidetic mathematical statements. Eidetic forms are 1, exact in measure and contour, 2, visually fixed, and 3, identically repeatable," end quote. Contra this doxa, Gego's most rigorous works plunge into the opacity of local effects, perceptual ambiguity, and contextual vacillation. These are geometries to be seen in a field, not to be read on a page. I have suggested elsewhere that Gego's complicated approach to geometry, space, and form springs from her professional background, sociocultural subject experience, as well as by her attempt to negotiate her dual artistic and pedagogic roles. No doubt, consciously or not, her work repudiated certain gender metaphors mobilized in Western science, as well as ideals of harmony, proportion, and strength that permeated Aryan discourses that banished difference and physical inadequacy. As philosopher Luz Irigaray has argued and Catherine Hales has elaborated, scientific narratives spring from canonical symbolics and, partly as a consequence of their material or mythical objectivity, abound on gender metaphors in which the feminine tends to be associated with a nature to be conquered at best and with obstacles to rationality and enlightenment at worst. Turbulence, complexity, nonlinearity, duplicity, chaos. This cultural status of the signifier, with its capacity to generate the apparently complete signified and its opposite, the other, that which is lacking, the negative, i.e. rational over irrational, mind over body, form over chaos, should be factored as part and parcel of Gego's historical negotiation of these symbolic dualities, and it is linked to her various experiences as a woman, an émigré, and in the industrial and applied areas of architecture, engineering, as well as in the artistic field. But this process of coming to terms with the artificial ecstasies of dual opposites was also the result of the artistic confrontation of the artist's confrontation with current developments in the urban and artistic topography of her adopted country. Like other women during this period, Mira Schendel in Brazil, and closer to New York, Eva Hesse, Gego's imaginary, and here I'm invoking Irigaray again, dwell on what patriarchal discourse has chosen not to symbolize, a sort of residual imaginary. And I direct you to Luis Enrique Pérez Orama's thorough study of Gego's relationship to kinetic art, to which I will, I won't refer his work a lot and has written thoroughly on this, bypassing though the feminist reference, and he reads these in terms of modernity in the third world. Now, the chorros are in this sense, in the sense of these residual imaginary, exemplary. Chorro has been translated in the English literature on Gego as a stream. But the word chorro is more pedestrian, lacking the rural and topographical connotations of streams while referring to the vigorous pouring of fluids. Gush, jet, or spurt might be a more appropriate term then, diverting the work from an unproblematic organic reading and problematizing the complex notion of nature that Gego entertained. The relevance of the chorros in Gego's production cannot be overestimated. Conceived as individual pieces, but always exhibited in groups, the chorros are irregular cascades of aluminum rods that end in loops, combined with elements of stainless steel or iron, and connected vertically to more rods that clash with the floor, while the whole piece hangs from the ceiling or wall. A willowing mass of metal linked horizontally with neighboring units, the chorros in photographs of exhibitions seem to be on the verge of absolute collapse due to the pull of gravity and their flexible constitution. The chorros alluded to nature but bypassed the harmonious interrelationship and hierarchical organization of parts to whole that is fundamental to the organic and that the Argentine critic Marta Drava identified as a key characteristic of Gego's work. Instead, the chorros embody fluidity and the dissipation of fluids while rejecting morphological and structural precision like no other series of works by Gego do. It is no coincidence that the late Miguel Arroyo, director of the Museum of Fine Arts, where Gego mounted for the first time her Reticularia, and a staunch supporter of the artist's work, told me in an interview that he didn't think the chorros were as successful as the Reticularia. He did elaborate, but I was under the impression that his disappointment had to do with the chorros' forsakenness of the constructivist question, which had been clearly problematized but kept under check in the reticular environment of 1969. Indeed, unlike in the Reticularia, there was no triangular model to deform in the chorros. The vertical cascading of the works was interrupted by the use of rods of different size and thickness, by spirals and by flexible linkages, not only vertical but horizontal. This method allowed the works to radiate and fuse randomly with neighboring pieces, accentuating the chaotic effect their flexible connecting system facilitated. Furthermore, Gego's recent efforts to think architecturally led her to dismiss the object-oriented tendency of much constructivist art in favor of an environmental proposition that radically transformed her understanding of artistic production. The lessons provided by the Reticularia and by the chorros proved fundamental. From now on, making and installing would become part and parcel of the unstable identity fostered by her weaving-like methods of construction and installation. This undoing of a sculptural aesthesis had been advanced by the artist's intermediatic approach to materials and artistic methods. Her interest in drawing, in sculpture, in architecture gave way to subtle but precise forms of medium disruption, which in the following years produced drawings without paper. And these are emblematic of that kind of medium disruption. And led her and her critics to speak of weaving as the method of construction that gave shape to the erratic morphology of the Reticularia, the chorros, but also to the more precise construction of the troncos and the spheres. I have argued that the Reticularia counters the exactness of geometry and the objectivity of scientific and historical discourse by introducing situatedness, the situatedness of the observer, as foundational to observation. Here, I want to suggest that the work produced during the 70s and the installations designed by Gego of that work during the same decade undermine the semantic dualities of paramount cultural concepts such as science, art, order, chaos, geometry, formlessness, masculine, feminine, by furthering an environmental logic which bypassed congealed identities and favored process. The latter would facilitate interactions between the orderly spheres and the chaotic chorros, between different structural methods, weaving and construction, between unity, works, and environments, installations, between inside museum and outside public work. The 1977 retrospective of Gego's work at the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de Caracas gave the artist ample opportunity to rehearse this fluid material and semantic negotiations with which her work had been concerned. And I'm showing you my favorite shot from that installation with the spheres on the foreground and the chorros. That's a glass window with cuerdas de Parque Central, or ropes of Central Park, outside the museum. That's a public work that's still in place. And for these installations, she prolonged those ropes into the exhibition space. On this occasion, the artist hung 13 chorros parallel to one of the large walls of glass of Gallery 3. Placed one after the other, the effect of the installation was energetic. A mass of metal lacking restraint and plastic definition. Or so it is what certain photographs convey as the impression one gets of this installation and of Gego's work in general is fully mediated by its photographic record. The photographs of that exhibition fascinate us in their disorienting capacity, as groups of works, single works, and space look completely different from one to the other. Proof, if a photograph can be proof of anything, that the vistas generated by Gego's work were fully dependent on the spectator's point of view. As a reviewer of the exhibition stated in an assessment of Gego's work, in words that can be extrapolated to understand the artist's treatment of the exhibition space, quote, "The transparency of the parallels allowed Gego to deliver in one sole vision all the angles and establish a continuity never interrupted between exterior and interior space, the unity of the nucleus, the periphery, and the surroundings," end quote. Behind the chorros, Gego positioned a series of spheres on the floor. Made of solid bronze rods and welded, they were radically different from the more ethereal and tissue-like spheres that she had been making the year before. These more rudimentary works resemble miniature geodesic domes and are not fully closed, meaning that a low horizontal cut creates a baseline to facilitate a stable positioning on the floor. It is obvious that these were conceived with the exhibition in mind as props to sit on the floor like bushes that would enhance the forest-like environment that Gego sought to evoke. Other works, such as those linking two or more spheres made of interlocking small steel rods and leader sleeves, most likely, here it is, two spheres from 1977, and again, 3 icosidodecaedros from 1977, were carefully interspersed among the heavier piece on the floor instead of hanging. In one of the floor plans drawn by Gego on the occasion of the exhibition, and I'm sorry I don't have an image of it, this grouping of spheres was called breñales, a Spanish plural for breñal, which alludes to a terrain of weeds and undergrowth, and which in the English dictionary, which translates as scrubland, is defined as an area of land that is uncultivated and covered with a spare, stunted vegetation, end quote. A symbolic affiliation with the concept of bicho, bug, which is how she called her works in general, can be detected here, and attests to Gego's continued disdain for idealized conceptions of nature, geometry, and sculpture. These welded spheres were neither exhibited again nor sold during Gego's life. Supplemental rather than individual works, these spheres were produced to advance the relational ethos that since 1969 permeated much of Gego's work. Piled up, they alluded to corrupting weeds, growing randomly and disorderly and obstructing the geometric generative matrix of the ethereal hanging spheres. A reviewer for the local English language newspaper defined this puzzling grouping of words as tumbleweeds A tumbleweed is the upper part of a plant that once dry breaks away from its roots, usually in the autumn, tumbling away in the wind. The reference is followed by citing the artist's words, apparently present on a press preview of the show. Quote, "That," Gego said, motioning towards the works as we were talking, is called monte, or I call it the monte, end quote. Now, monte, like Breñales, is part of that semantic horizon invoked by Gego to reference the residual and marginal nature in her work. If you are a respectful gardener, you do not want monte nor Breñales in your garden. Close by, the troncos acted as a counterpoint to the unruly messiness of the Breñales and the chorros, and they're here, barely seen against this white wall. They were offered to the viewer as a group, but their more conventional and respectful spatial distribution obeyed sculptural codes. These were to be subverted in the photographs produced for the 1977 book published on the occasion of the retrospective. In page after page, we see images that emphasize shadows projected on the wall, dramatic lighting that distorts the geometric shapes, out of focus works that diffuse the sharp linearity of the model, the close-up of an outdoor piece that features the artist's face, and drops of water that liquefy the white painted iron structure. Reflective plexiglass used as a base for groupings of works called lines that doubles the entanglement of thin steel aluminum wires suggesting all-overness and gravity-defying forms. Overexposed images of an ethereal reticularia and crisscross chorros defying gestalt. In the aforementioned book, the troncos are photographed against a black background and illuminated in such a way as to make the reflective stainless steel a flat drawing delineating space. These photographic disorienting operations are replicated in a puzzling picture taken around the same time where three troncos overlap, displacing clarity and structure in favor of the confusing enmeshments favored by Gego's work. The organic reading of Gego's work has been pervasive, and she herself has given us abundant testimony of her admiration for the rational structuring of nature. Contra this idealized view of Gego's work as communing with nature, sharing its logic and causal behavior, I want to argue that the erratic and precarious operated as forces that allowed the artist to formulate a paradigm of artistic production capable of accounting for a marginal and residual imaginary that folded inside out the geometric and constructivist matrix that prevailed in her work and that of her peers. To wit against the eidetic nature of geometry that founded her artistic and pedagogical practice, Gego's work proposed an operational model capable of negotiating external forces, local knowledge, material contingencies, and process-oriented behavior. In this light, her embracement of applied logic of construction, of a process of a sculptural deformation, of a method of connectivity that refutes identity and hierarchy of residual materials, can be seen as elaborating a marginal sculptural practice that is homologous to rigorous exploration of a residual imaginary. Gego's tacit alignment with an ideological positioning intent on problematizing the dominant patriarchal symbolic discourse springs from a playful skepticism towards geometry and mathematics, monumentality, and the techno-scientific, accompanied by a critical stance toward medium specificity as manifested in the strict functionalism of architecture and the monumental claims of sculpture. Despite Gego's profound understanding and interest in these disciplines, her work delighted in the in-between, the gray areas that emerge between understanding and perception, precision and formlessness, geometric form and flow. Medium was a constant to be undermined from within, as her clear dismissal of volume, mass, shape, and delineation, as well as of the normative vocabulary of the fine arts makes clear. Despite her discipline and professional demeanor, her work favored a dissipation of mediums. In a 1974 interview with Venezuelan critic Maria Fernanda Palacios, she declared, quote, "I would dare to say that the artist is a product of the Renaissance that is about to die. Today, the different fields of work are linked. There are bridges that go from the artisan to the designer, and from these to the artist. In each specific area of our activity comes together a conglomerate of different factors, of possibilities and solutions that intercross and belong to different fields of experience," end quote. It is this intercrossing that she rehearsed in the 70s and perfected in the 80s with her humble tejeduras, translated as weavings. It was Gego's own way of scrambling the symbolic order, of weaving, that is, the space in between. Thank you very much.
Good. We have a bit of time for questions. Anything burning? Let me get things going, and then the other questions will emerge. It's really interesting, and I'm sorry I forgot to mention the title of your paper, which is obviously so crucial for your paper at the very beginning. The title is on the screen.
I read it. It's okay. No problem.
I like what you're doing by making the argument that contrary to the rigidity of geometry, Gego is introducing the spectator. The spectator breaks up the rigidity of geometry. In other words, she's fascinated with geometry, which is part number one of your argument here, and something as well known. She's fascinated with mathematics in particular. But in order to counter geometry and mathematical models, she is introducing the spectator. Now, I'm wondering to what extent you would be willing to contemplate a slightly different possibility, which is actually a historical possibility in this particular moment, because really we're talking about the 1960s, 70s, and it's a moment where you have a number of models being presented about a mathematical definition of information. Shannon and Weaver, a whole bunch of people introducing the notion of information. Information is mathematical. So I wonder to what extent, instead of it being the spectator that introduces the fluidity to the rigid geometry, we could consider it being another side of geometry, namely the very fluidity of geometry itself versus the rigidity of geometry. In other words, the idea that within geometry, it's not always rigid, because as we know with information, networks is the term that starts to be used at this point. Today we live in the era of networks. Networks are very fluid, and then a network doesn't need a spectator. So there's a rigid geometry, and then there's the fluid geometry, which is the era that we live in today, which is outside of, I think, the spectatorship.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would be so assertive to say that she introduces the observer. You're right. I don't think that is implicit or it follows as a consequence of how she's interested in these gap between, again, the model, the geometric model, and perception, or the geometric model in context, or the geometric model in relation to other works and to the architectural setting. So as part of that, the observer plays a different, a renewed role. I don't think that she's necessarily thinking in terms of the observer with such consciousness. I think she's interested in that gap between the model, the geometric model, and what happens to that model when you put it in space, especially considering her methods of construction, right? The transparency implicit in her methods of construction. This is part of a larger study, and I have been looking actually specifically at hydraulics, not so much information, but that's why I mentioned Catherine Hales, and how hydraulics is a field that is very contested since it requires nonlinear equations to be described, to be analyzed. And this issue of the nonlinear equation is key in the 70s and there were some people working on these. Catherine Hales has established connections to fractal geometry. So I do think absolutely that there is a kind of alternative model of looking at geometry and physics that it's being discovered and is being studied in the 70s. And that's why both Catherine Hales, Lucy Digaray is attracted to it, and Catherine Hales has been kind of attempting to historically ground that attraction to hydraulics, not necessarily as something that can be philosophically appropriated or it's metaphorically appealing, but actually as introducing alternative understandings of science, again, the non-linearity of equations. And I'm afraid to say all of this in front of the Universidad Metropolitana that has very good people in this field. So there is a historical context for that. I, of course, deal with hydraulics specifically because of the chorros. This was in relationship to the chorros. But I think that, yes, that fractal geometry is one other universe that can be invoked here. I think that the way geometric models behave in space through these transparent methods of construction, and I argue for this relational more than an environmental dynamics, relational and environmental, more than thinking that it's just the observer that she's thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I was picking up on your claim that Gego's work generated vistas that were fully dependent on the spectator's position. I mean, I was going on that. I mean, a vista that's fully dependent on the spectator's position is where I thought you were including the
and I think that
break up the geometry.
Right, and I think there's a testament from reviewers at the time that are the late Roberto Guevara and other reviewers at the time call attention to this. How these different vistas, these relational dynamics, how the position that you occupy allows for different connections. So I'm kind of picking up on that too. On the kind of literature that was, the reviews that were not so much literature, there was a very few things, but that was being produced at the time. And so reviewers picked up on that a little bit. And I think, of course, I mean, you could even say that about a sculpture in general, right? That the position of the viewer generates different perceptions of the work. But I think that this relational quality, the seeing through beyond, without an opaque background, that where the form or the gestalt pops out. It was picked up by many at the time as part of a relational situation that involves obviously not only the space, the work, but also the viewer. Yes.
Yes. I thought that we are forgetting that the geometrical use of art starts before the golden rule.
I'm sorry, before?
The golden rule.
The golden rule in Egypt, where they concerned. But also, I wanted to mention that physics also has something to do with the impressionists and the idea of, sometimes I consider this kind of spider work is not necessarily separate, I mean, from the idea of closing, although with the reticularia is the start of the opening through the transparency. But it happened, with Louis Nevelson, for instance, that kind of
compartmentalization.
Right. Then with Louis Bourgeois, that again, it opens, right? So it's something that is being used, I think, that as an independent movement from men also, in which, the very static thing opens.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, how to make that claim without falling in sort of simplifications of saying, okay, women are using this open form. I think I would stay away from that. I think that there is, she feels the freedom to Gego operated quite lonely, quite, in relationship to her peers, no doubt. She was part of that meeting. She tried very hard to break in, exhibit in the States, and she showed in New York. She and Gerd Leufer were interested in having a community. She also, I think, her training and how she was really interested in the notion of play. And that's a word that pops up a lot in her, few interviews or some of the interviews. And I think that I would like to think of it as rehearsing an alternative imaginary that is not only against the kinetics, but also a counterpoint or a riposte to her training as an architect, as an engineer, as a teacher of geometry in the setting of the institute, in the setting of the Universidad Central. So not only a riposte to the kinetic art that was very prevalent at the time, and to geometric abstraction and constructivism as a legacy, but also an alternative or a counter-narrative to her professional background and profession. Yes?
Just something that kept coming to mind as I was listening. I actually have a similar background to her, but my family escaped to Australia instead of to Argentina.
Venezuela.
Yeah. So I was thinking about her work in terms of the abstract expressionists and the time that she did it, where I also see it as a reaction to the horror of what was happening in her background of mass murder, and I was thinking that maybe there's some beauty and comfort in searching for truth, and the geometrics is a kind of perfection, not perfection because there's a disorder in that too, but it's something real, it's something. She's defining space, she's going back to the basics of what is existence, what is real, and then the play, which is laid on top of that, is a kind of finding your own joy of being alive and being human, and connected to the environment. So there's a flow between the psychological space and the physical space that she's playing out over and over again, like she's screaming out that she's alive.
Yeah, somebody's talking about the Sabiduras today, which is the book that was published of her, very few, mostly written for herself, and I don't know that she ever imagined that this were going to be published. And I think, that's something that someone more invested in the biographical. I think the biographic is absolutely crucial. I think that she says, all these experiences, she says it in that great quote from 1974, all our experiences allow us to create bridges and adapt, and I think that she's really hinting at how much her work is nourished and informed by all her experiences, not just as an architect, not just an engineer. She's talking, of course, about architecture and the artisan and the designer, but then she goes into the word experiences, and I think that absolutely her subject position. Now, in terms of how consciously she thought of that as a refuge from her past. I'm more shy to make direct links, but I think they're absolutely relevant. Absolutely. Anyone else? Carlos.
Gracias, Mónica. I guess this is in English, so I may have missed because I arrived a little bit late, and you may have already spoken about this, but I think that this confrontation between the idealized geometry and the translation of that into a physical construction is really the paradigm of architecture. And it is exactly what she did for years at the Universidad Central with her students, making these models. So, and to some extent, the influence is there. I mean, I don't know if you already mentioned this. is what was in the air, not as a reaction against abstract expressionism, but as a continuity of her training as an architect.
Yeah.
And the Bauhaus, and specifically what was very much in fashion then, which were the geometric models made by Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about Gego is that she takes the fundamental confrontation of geometry into material, which is the essence of the problem of architecture, into space.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes. No, absolutely. We did talk about that. And I use the word eidetic, which I meant to ask someone if that's how you pronounce it. Eidetic, A-E-I. Yeah, I kept using, I used it a lot, and I hope everybody understood that, yes, absolutely, was that ideal or eidetic aspect of the geometric model that she, translated. You're right to bring up, and I talk a little bit about this at that symposium on Bauhaus, that the model making, it's something I think should be paid more attention, something we could study further. Model making. She, was rehearsing a lot of these exercises, at the institute, at the universidad. She could do so much with that, and then she allowed herself to further experiment with that. And I think it is the geometric model in space, and again through these methods of construction that establish, again, something relational, something that really is beyond the static, the aesthesis of the model on a page, let's say, or something to be read instead, something to be perceived in a field. And that, I think, it's a lesson that she also takes from the Reticularia from 1969. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.